Frog Hop is a game that's heavily focused on platforming. So when it came to coding the game, there needed to be a system that uses simple physics to help us experience the movement and gameplay. So let's start with the basic concepts and work our way up. The game is based around using X and Y values, where X is your horizontal position, so left and right, and then Y is your vertical, so that's up and down. And it's two values since it is a 2D game and we're not working in 3D. The game is run by what are called frames, so they're kind of seen as like increments in time. So as time goes by, the game will gradually go to the next frame. So we're going to use a variable. In this case, let's just use x speed. For every frame that occurs, the game checks our x speed value and applies it to our x position. So a quick example is if we have an x speed of 1, it adds 1 to our x position every frame. And since the game runs at 60 frames per second, it means that the player moves at a speed of 60 pixels per second. Now when a block is in the way, we check if there's a block ahead of where we're moving, and if there is, we set our speed to 0. That way we don't get stuck into it. So when we're in game, pressing left makes our x speed negative, and pressing right makes our x speed positive. Likewise, when we jump, our y speed initially starts off negative, but as gravity is applied and we start to fall, our y speed becomes positive. From a coding standpoint, working with whole numbers where you're moving at increments of 1, 2, and 3, things should be going just fine, but from a design perspective, it can be difficult to work with this, especially when we're working with a low resolution pixel art game. Because of this design issue, we probably want more control instead of just working in whole numbers. So to work with more precise values such as 0.5 or 0.31, we need to adjust how the logic works. So this is where we need to get into what I would call like repeat variables. And this is how we get our movement to be a little more precise in game. So let's use a grid, and instead of making our x speed 1, let's make it 1.5. So for every frame, we're moving at a speed of 1.5 pixels, and the game is designed so that we can only be in a whole number position and never in a subpixel. So a subpixel would be the in-between spot. Between 0 and 1, a subpixel position would be 0.5 or 0.4, whereas a pixel perfect whole number would be 0 or 1. So because of one of our problems is moving at a speed of 1.5, that can result in subpixel movements. So we have to utilize our repeat variables in such a way that we always move in whole number increments. I'll kind of give you a better example of how this works from a fundamental standpoint. For the first frame, we're moving at a speed of 1.5. On the first frame, what we do is we move our character by 1 pixel and store the remainder for the next frame. So now that the next frame has come, we add that remainder 0.5 to 1.5 since we're always moving at a speed of 1.5, which means on the second frame we're moving at 2 pixels. The cycle then repeats and allows us to use pretty much any value that we want and still move in pixel perfect steps. Now that our movement is able to be rounded up by whole numbers, that means we can also use a little bit more advanced functionality such as acceleration. It might feel a little bit unnatural to just, when you press right, you instantly move right, whereas having just a little bit of acceleration where your character gradually speeds up might feel a little bit more natural. So what we do is, when we press right, we don't instantly move at a speed of 1.5. Instead, for every frame that passes, we use an acceleration variable and we keep adding it to our x speed. So initially, when we're not pressing directions, our x speed would be 0. And then when we press right, we keep adding our acceleration value each frame, and that's what increases x speed until it reaches its maximum velocity. And of course, when we let go of right, we gradually decrease x speed by just continually applying a deacceleration variable to it for every frame. So that's how the x movement works. In terms of y movement, it's literally the same thing. The only real difference is that when there is ground below us, our y speed is 0, so that we don't fall through the floor. And if we're in the air, we apply a gravity value to our y speed every frame, very much just like how the acceleration worked with that x speed example. Whenever we press jump while on solid ground, our y speed is instantly set to a negative number, which is what starts the initial impulse of the jump. And again, that same rule where if there's ground below us, set our y speed to 0, but since there is no ground below us and we're in the air because of our jump, we have to keep gradually applying our gravity value to our y speed so that it naturally goes from a negative value to positive. So because of the fact that we've designed a system that allows us to move in whole pixel numbers instead of subpixels, it creates for a very crisp movement, and it makes it really easy to manage collisions, while at the same time we can still work with very precise movement values and have other features like acceleration. So this is going to get a little bit into the technical part of how this all functions. So we'll kind of break it down again, just like how we started with the x and y. So these built-in variables that I have, we have the x vel and y vel, which are the x speed and y speed that I was describing. And then we have the acceleration variables, which when I mentioned before, as soon as you press right or left, these will continually apply or remove their specified amounts to these x and y velocity values. And then we have x speed limit, which is shorthanded because to save time when you're coding, it's easier for notation to shorten your variable names. So we have x speed limit so that it doesn't go past 0.85, and then we have we have y speed limit as well, so that we don't fall like at an insanely high speed, as well as jump at an insanely high speed. These are special variables that I use for pausing. That's kind of its own beast, how pausing functions. Maybe I could do a video on that, but we'll see. And then this is the real deal right here. So x count, y count, x round, and y round. These are the I call them the repeat variables. These are what allows us to basically move our character in those very specific increments. So I have the player input functionality, and we'll just kind of show the left and right inputs. Keyboard check, so that's whenever we hold the right arrow, it checks if the binded key, which is the right arrow, is pressed. And we also have the left, which is just L, and that checks the global binding for the left arrow key or whatever key you've binded. Let's go to the actual math. So it's not too complicated. The basic idea behind it is this line of code checks if we're pressing left and we're not pressing right. Because in some games have flawed code where if you press both directions, which is only really possible on the keyboard, the game can like freak out or just it does weird visual glitches. But it just checks if we're pressing left. It tells our character to draw himself so that he faces left, and then we have it so it plays the run animation because he's moving. And this code right here, so x velocity, this is applying a constant value to x velocity, which is our x speed. And this code right here basically just tells it to, for every frame, if it's still below the x speed limit, then keep applying our our acceleration, and then eventually if it hits the ceiling, our max x speed limit, it just tells it that it clamps it so that it can't go any higher than that. And it's the exact same way with pressing right arrow, so that it literally does the opposite, so except for applying run animations. And of course we have, if you press neither button and you're in neutral position, and or if you manage to only on a keyboard press both arrow keys, then you just slow down to a halt. So that's why we set run to false, because we want to make our animation stop playing. And then we have, so this just checks if you're moving, whichever direction you're moving, it'll neutralize it, so that no matter which way you're going, it'll take care of that. And then we'll just go over how the repeat variables work. So now at the physics code, what we do is we have the x count and x round, and that essentially x count will first grab the current value of x velocity on this frame. And then what we do is we tell xRound to grab the whole number of what we've taken. So if x velocity is 1.5, xRound takes that 1.5 and it cuts away the 0.5 and just is 1. And then lastly, we of course need a remainder value for later. So x count is minus, you just subtract xRound to that, so that way you get the remainder. So x count now has the 0.5 and xRound has the 1 essentially. So now we have our repeat function. So this is where all the magic happens with adjusting our player's position properly, so that we move in very specific increments per frame. And then what we do is we grab that whole number that we had, if you remember. So in this case it'll be 1 or 1.5, but we're just going to move once. So we just make sure that number is positive, because I think GameMaker would like freak out if it was negative. So this is just to make sure it does it one time. It runs all of this one time. Then all we do is just to simplify this, it does some simple collision checks. So the basic idea is, I'll try to translate this for you. So if there's a block that is 1 pixel ahead of us, like it's directly ahead of us, then we would just instantly like move at a speed of 0, because you can't walk through walls, so that's what it does. If there is not a block ahead of us, to simplify it carefully, because this is all this is code for a gimmick for push blocks. The idea is if there is nothing in front of us, then you just simply apply our stored whole number onto our x value. So x plus equals sign round. And its sign means if we were to move at a speed of, instead of 1, what if it was 2 or 3 or 4? What it does is it makes sure that it ticks us every single frame. Not every frame, but it increments us on this frame. So if we were instead, let's say our speed is 3, it tells this to repeat this whole function 3 times. And so it'll keep repeating whatever checks it needs to. And so let's say there's a block that's like it's 2 empty spaces and then it's the wall. So if we're moving at a speed of 3, it would just tick us once, and then it would go through again, tick us again, because there's empty space, and now there's a wall in front of us. So on the 3rd tick, we would just tell it to set its speed to 0. And this is pretty much functionality wise, it's very much the same as Y. It obviously doesn't check for that gimmick with the push block. I could definitely code that in, but I just didn't see. That's a whole nother story with the game design. But that's kind of how it all works. I know it's a lot more nerd talk in this part, but I hope it was at least comprehensible. So that's the basic gist as to how the movement physics work in Frog Hop. If you are curious to know about how other parts of Frog Hop or my other games are coded, feel free to ask your questions below, and I'll see if I can make a video about that. Also, feel free to check out Frog Hop, which can be purchased on Steam or itch.io, and thanks for watching.